Thank you, and good morning. We have a very full hour ahead of us, and as Fiona said at the end of the hour, if any of you want to stay on, if you have questions, I'm happy to stay on afterwards, but we'll need the full hour for the content of this. It was down as a training course originally. This is a 1 hour intensive session, so be prepared. Okay. I'll give you 30 seconds on myself in a moment, which Fiona's already introduced me, so that'll be quick, and our company and who we are, what we do. That'll be very quick. We'll talk about the objectives for today, just 4 objectives. And then I want to spend some time answering the question, why do risk management? If you're not already motivated to do it, and I reckon a lot of you are doing it already, even if you don't call it that, but do formal risk management. Do it better than you're doing today. And for those of you who probably say, well, what is risk management? And maybe its definition is required. Again, it's not black art, but I will address that. And then we'll get into the nub of the matter, the risk management framework and process, in particular, the process. A few key things that people always want to spend some time in is risk criteria and risk appetite. Risk appetite is the least understood concept in risk management. So I hopefully will shed some light on that for you. And finally, we'll end on whose job is it anyway? We all have a role to play in the organization. So we'll spend some time on that. Okay. As Fiona said, I chair the National Committee in Ireland on Risk Management Standards and work with other international bodies like the British Standards in TC 262, that's the technical committee in ISO, and that was the committee that was responsible for the introduction of 31000 many years ago. I've been involved ever since. And some years ago, myself and Paul, we founded CalQRisk. And CalQRisk is, and this is the only slide on the company and the product, we produce a governance, risk and compliance platform, basically. And if you want to manage risks and the tasks associated with it and your counterparties or third parties, record incidents or risk events, loss events, all can be done on the one platform. It's modular, so you can acquire as much or as little as you require. Anybody's interested afterwards, do check our website. That's what we do. So we're embedded in this industry, in this sector, and we know risk management and compliance. Okay, that's us. So that's our background. The objectives for today, I'd like to think that at the end of this session, you'll have a much better idea of what risk management involves, and you'll be familiar with the process. And the process is the process described in the 31000, fairly standard. There are variations, but in essence, they're all effectively the same. Important is that you understand the roles of individuals. We have seen in the past how risk manager or the risk officer, people expect they're the ones who are managing the risk. No, they're not. Everybody in the organization is a risk manager, and the risk officer is the person that you'd look to for support, for help, for training, for encouragement, etc. And I'd like to think at the end of the session, you'd know what to look for. If you're in a senior position, if you're a director, that you would know what to look for to ensure that risk is being managed effectively. In most codes of practice or governance codes of practice, there's a statement that says the board of directors have to attest as to the effectiveness of risk management and controls, internal controls. But how do you know? How do you know it's effective? I'll try and cover some of that too. Okay. Why do risk management? And I have 7 reasons here for you. First one is, it increases the likelihood that you'll achieve your objectives. Very simply. You're focusing on what matters by default. It's forward-looking. That is, you're trying to identify what could go wrong and where the uncertainties might bite you. This whole process, I would say the formal process of doing risk management, because you have to look at the risks, see what controls in place, see where the gaps are, see where you're good. And maybe if you're very good, you see opportunities where you could take more risk. If you have a capability, and I like to prefer to call it a capability, maybe you can take on more risk. More about that later. Some people describe risk management as just better or informed decision making. And certainly if you're making better decisions because you have better information, you fully understand the risks, less things will go wrong, you'll be more successful. Bottom line, there'll be improved performance. And isn't that what we all want at the end of the day? Improved performance. If you're in a senior management role or board role, you'll understand about governance, and it's probably obvious statement to say that effective governance will demand that you do risk management. Okay. Hopefully I've convinced you that you should do risk management if you're not doing it already, but I guess by being on the session here today, you are already a believer. So what is risk management? I've taken two definitions here, and they're very similar. One from the ISO guide 73 on definitions: coordinated activities to direct and control an organization with regard to risk. Sounds like management. It is. It's just management with regard to risk. And in the blue book, or the orange book, it says coordinated activities designed and operated to manage risk and exercise internal control within an organization. Now that's just adding a stress on the internal controls, which my reading of it is, it's those financial controls. Now controls to me are things that you put in place to manage the risk. So it's really all about risk management. And the controls, as I said, is a subset under the risk. So what is the risk? And interestingly, here the definitions are in agreement as well. And there are many definitions of risk, but this is what the ISO committee has agreed on. Not immediately obvious, because people think, isn't risk bad things that might happen? No. Think of your objectives and the effect of uncertainty on the achievement of those objectives. If there was no uncertainty, you would achieve your objectives. You have no risk. But because of the uncertainty, there is a risk. There are risks that threaten your objectives. If you don't have any objectives, you don't have any risks, very simply. So think of, what are you protecting? What are you trying to achieve? And what could threaten that? The Orange Book says, it's the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and it's usually expressed in terms of causes, potential events, and their consequences. I was trying to think of an example, and it might be unable to, that you're unable to service debt. And the cause might be global interest rates rising, and your payment terms are linked to that. And as a consequence, now you're in financial bother, shall we say, and maybe you have to cancel some other projects. That's an understanding of a risk. A risk isn't an event. It's not just interest rates going up. It's the consequences, if you like, from events. It's both. It's both. Okay. So risks are things that, I suppose, affect our objectives in a sense. And if it doesn't affect your objective, it's not a risk you should be worried about. I want to talk about corporate governance and risk management and the relationship. On the one hand, the board, I guess, want to facilitate effective, entrepreneurial and prudent management that can deliver the long-term goals of the organization. Now, when you see entrepreneurial and prudent in the same sentence, you think, is this a conflict? I prefer to think of it as a tension. And it's guiding the organization down that fine line between taking too much risk, being gung-ho, and being too conservative. So you don't want to be risk averse, you just want to be risk aware, is what I would say, and only take what you can actually bear. More about risk appetite later. Whereas risk management is more, first of all, it's dynamic and it's day to day, it's responsive to change. You're looking forward to see what could happen and coming up with things to prevent, where you can, prevent an impact on your organization. But align it with the objectives, and this is important. Too many organizations have people going off in many directions, managing risk, but manage risk that matters is what I would say. Compliance, and you will have probably in your organizations a risk officer and a compliance officer, and sometimes they're combined. There is a lot of overlap, and that's why you can combine them, but if it's a big organization, it might require a separation. To me, compliance is complying with rules, regulations, which are a minimum standard that somebody has set, the regulator, because they've stepped into a sector because the sector has failed to agree, let's say, minimum standard. And I use a car often in my sessions to explain maybe terms in very everyday terms. You have to have tax and insurance. You have to wear seatbelts in your car. And there's, we could probably list off 20 other regulations that somebody has written that we have to do. But nobody says you have to get your car serviced. Nobody says you have to check the oil. Nobody says that you have to have airbags. So how would you do it? You would do it because you're managing the risk. You want to travel from Birmingham to London safely and arrive on time. So you will manage that risk, and you will service your car, and you will ensure that if you do have an accident, that you are well protected. So that's the difference. But I see non-compliance as a big source of risk. And certainly in any risk register, I would have a number of risks, I guess, that are non-compliance with various regulations or obligations. Certainly they should work together. Now, I looked at the list of attendees earlier, and I know that most of you are professional managers, so you don't need me to tell you what a management system looks like. But what I want to say here with the next 3 slides is that a risk management framework is no different to your management system. This could be entitled just a management system, and in brackets, risk. It's the Plan, Do, Check, Act, which is kind of fundamental in most management system approaches. I'm going to go quickly through it because I think you know this, but just to give this completeness, okay? You start with the context and leadership, and if it's about risk, what are the objectives? What's the scope? Who are the stakeholders? What's required, right? And you could apply this to any discipline, whether it's financial control or health and safety. You could apply this to any narrow or broad definition or discipline. Then before you start, demonstrate leadership. And I think the starting point often is a policy that is maybe written by the senior management, but approved by the board, which sets out roles, responsibilities, and indeed also the providing the resources. If you're going to do something, it has to be also resourced with people, with budget, etc. Then the person who's responsible will go and create the plan, identify the threats and opportunities to whatever the objectives are, establish processes, establish roles and responsibilities, who's going to do what and how you're going to measure it. So they do all that planning, and then they do it. Implement it, record the results, check that it's working as expected, and you'll have checking by the risk officer, you'll have checking by the auditor. Checking is in different forms. When you check, plan to check, you act on the results of those checks, and maybe it's addressing the non-conformities or improving controls where they're not working. What you're seeing here in these 3 slides basically is that the management system or the risk management framework is no different in structure to how you manage the company today. So don't create a separate framework as such. I would say update your management system to include risk if it's not in there already. Okay. The starting point, and I've put this in because I think the policy is key to getting off to a good start, or if you're already well into risk management, have you a policy? And if you don't have a policy, do write one, because it tends to clarify the thinking and ensure that everybody is going in the same direction. Now, I've written a policy with these 7 headings, and I always use these headings in policies that I write generally, except obviously the risk appetite. Happy to share my template with anybody who's interested. Just send us an email and we'll send you that. I'll send you the Word version as well, so you can copy and paste as you wish. Scope and rationale. Why are you doing it? Why are you doing risk management? What's the scope? Is it the whole organization? Is it just one department? Is it just the the new developments, or is it the existing operations? Is it just IT? Is it finance? I would encourage you to do it enterprise-wide, but what do you hope to achieve, you know, at the end of a year, end of 3 years? And then the policy statements, what you will do and your commitment. And this is giving the person who's going to be responsible the mandate to do this. Risk appetite, and I will dig deep down into appetite later. How much risk are you willing to take in pursuit of your objectives? How are you going to measure your risk management performance? How do you know it's working? Will you be able to say after 6 months, after a year, this risk management is actually has done us good? We've, you know, less losses. We're hitting our targets more frequently. How will you measure it? Policy should state who's responsible for what, and it should state, I think, not just a commitment, but training, that you will train and how you're going to train your people. Because remember, everybody's a risk manager, so there may be a need for, it could be a 1 hour course like this, it could be a 1 day course. Okay, that's the policy. Let's talk about the process. This is from the 31,000 standard. We don't have time today to go through all sections of it, but I'm going to focus on the middle bit, the scope, the context criteria. That's in the standard, and in most standards now, there's a section called Understanding the Organization. And basically, we'll see in a moment, it's about, before you sit down, make sure you have a clear understanding of your own organization, so that you can move to the risk assessment, identify the risks, because if you don't have the complete picture, you're going to miss some risks, and then the treatment. I'm going to address those 3 sections today. Communication, monitoring, and reporting is, I won't say self-explanatory. We could spend some time on that, but fundamentals really is the central part here. Establishing the context. And I say it's important to document this for yourself. If you're the person responsible for managing the risk, you need to give yourself that context. You need to, I would say, write it down. The objectives, if you don't have objectives, you can't really go any further in risk management. The internal and external environment, you know, the structure of the organization. Are you in one location? Are you in multiple locations? You know, are you going to manage the risk in all locations? Your housing stock, is it in one location? Is it in 21 locations? And how old is it? And, you know, something to describe it. You'll see in a moment why it's important to have all these. Your third parties, or counterparties, if you prefer to call them that you depend on, that are a big part of your strategic objectives. And of course, be aware of your legal and regulatory obligations, because they will certainly determine some of the work you have to do. How are you going to measure risk? If you're using a 5x5 scale for your risk criteria, likelihood and consequence, or impact and probability, what does a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mean? More about that later. Risk appetite, again, how much risk are you willing to take? These need to be, I would say, defined initially and maybe refined after 3 or 6 months when you've got some experience of doing risk assessments. Who are the stakeholders? And again, this is important. It's not just your tenants and local communities, the funders, the auditors, the regulators. Write them all down, because again, these are interested parties who might want to see the evidence of your risk assessment, but also maybe source of risk themselves. And so on to the scope of the risk assessment. What is your risk assessment framework? You know, are you just going to look at operational risks? Are you going to look at strategic risks? Are you going to look at financial risks, cybersecurity, health and safety, data protection? It's your decision, but I would encourage a big top-down approach initially, but not exclusively. I would allow some bottom-up risks to appear as well. Key risk indicators. I have one slide on this later. Things that will tell you, they're trends, if you wish. You know, if you measure complaints, for example, and you have 10 complaints in January and 15 in February and 20 in March, you can nearly guess already how many you're going to have in April unless you change something. Okay, that's the context. So you understand the context. Now you can start looking to do a risk assessment. And risk assessment is 3 steps. It's identify the risks, first of all, because if you haven't identified a risk, you're carrying it possibly unwittingly. Analyze the risk. So what controls have you in place? What's working? Where are the gaps? Maybe what do you need to fix? And the evaluation is after the analysis saying, we can do better, or we can accept it as it is. We don't need to do anything. And the treatment then is following on from that evaluation and maybe adding controls or improving controls. So let's have a look at that. Now, there are, I'm going to say 25 plus techniques for risk assessment. I've chosen here the bow tie technique to explain, I suppose, basic principles. Even the bow tie is a combination of fault tree analysis and event tree analysis. The idea here is that if you have called an event, you've arrived at a point where the interest rates are crippling you. How did that happen, and how could you prevent that in the first place? Now, this is a difficult one. I admit I probably picked a hard risk as an example here. It would be easy to say a data breach and things you can do to prevent the data breach. But everything to the left are things you will do now, today, to try and prevent that, let's say, difficult circumstance. I don't want to call it an event or event from occurring. Everything to the right is then the consequences. So you have the crippling industry. What does that mean for the organization? Does it mean you can't start those new projects? Does it mean that other projects get delayed, or are you in financial trouble? Do you have to go begging for more money? The detection is probably, it's easier to explain with the data breach. If the event is a data breach, how will you know you've got a data breach? But even the crippling interest rates, you don't want to wake up one morning to find you're in trouble. Do you have some key risk indicator that will tell you you're going to have a problem in 3 months' time? So just to populate this a little bit, the source of the risk might come from poor skills and knowledge in those people who were agreeing to the interest rates in the first place, and some contracts or covenants. But I'm sure you're all well skilled in that. It might be complacency. We've had low interest rates for years. They're going to continue. Maybe not. It could be through poor assessments or the external environment. It could be out of your control. It could be global interest rates because energy has gone up, etc. But from principle, from a risk assessment technique point of view, whatever the risk, there are things you can do, like having a policy, having procedures, having checks. These are all some of the things you will do to prevent the undesirable event. You'll have measures in place to detect the event, and then if something happens, like a data breach, or you have crippling interest rates, what's your response going to be? Have you thought about that? You should have thought about that. Think about data breach, and you don't have a plan to how you're going to react to it. You're in trouble. So mitigation, using the English definition of the term on this side, is lessening the severity of, rather than mitigation of risk is generally is inclusive of all prevention, detection, and mitigation. But here it's something has happened and now you want to minimize or lessen the severity of that bad incident, shall we call it. You need to have thought about this. This is encapsulation of really a risk management, risk assessment approach. So I'm going to take 3 slides to show you how I go from your objectives to risks, because what a lot of people ask is, well, how do we identify the risks? Again, I said there are lots of techniques. Here's one, but it'll give you an idea. If you move the knot on the bow tie over to the right, and you've one risk, which is the association is no longer viable. How do you go from that to risks? Well, let's say these were your 5 main objectives. And I've tried, I won't pretend to be an expert in your sector, but I've tried to document ones that I would imagine you might have. And if we move those a bit to the left, and then it looks like this, but I'm going to replace these objectives with very similar wording, but now expressed as a risk. We failed in our diversification plan to diversify into student accommodation. We have an unacceptable quality of service to tenants, and that's marked by lots of complaints, etc. We have an untenable financial position. These are key I would call it high-level risks. I can move the knot one step further left if I take one of those risks, take each of them and do this, and say, well, what could lead to untenable financial position? And I might come up with a list of 6 or 10 other risks, failure to manage existing debt, failure to raise new debt. The sales income is far below expectations. And you see the way this is going. I mean, the further more you go to the left, the more risks you will have. And you'll get down to a very granular level, too deep, and you'll have too many risks. You don't want 500 risks, and you don't want one. At the high level, the board want to see maybe 10 or 15 key risks. But on a day-to-day management basis, you're managing the detail in the organization. So that's how you go from high level, if you like, to detailed risk. An example. Okay. And that's back to the crippling one. That's how we got to the crippling interest rates one. Okay. Some definitions now, and we'll try to move a bit faster. Risk appetite, the amount of type of risk that you're willing to accept in pursuit of your objectives. Criteria, how are you going to measure the level of risk? If you use a 5x5 scale, and here's one, what does a 5 in consequence mean? What does a 4? And you need to agree this so that if you have 10 people assessing risks, they're using the same scale, the same yardstick, as it were. A technique that, or a inherent risk and residual risk isn't always used, but it is very popular. And inherent risk is a difficult concept to fully implement, I guess. To understand, yes, what's the inherent risk? What's the risk of a fire in the building if you had no controls? Right, well, what controls do you take into account? Well, if it had no smoke detectors, then people say, well, what do I exclude from the building because it's already built? Difficult one, but it is in use. I like to think of what would be the level of risk if significant controls were to fail. And here I have it in the screen here. What's the worst that could happen if several controls were to fail? And I would say that's your inherent risk. And the residual risk is then where you've brought it with the controls that you've in place. Okay. Okay, let's continue on. So you assess your risks, and you might end up with a risk register looking something like this. And this would be fairly typical. There'll be some deviations on it, but fairly typical, but it's not mandatory. But the idea is you have a category of risk, the risk description, you have an owner of the risk, and I think that's important. A list of the controls that you have in place, and there's the pre-control or the inherent level of risk, 16, and then the post-control when you've considered all the controls you've in place, and you consider it's lower, but maybe there are things you still could do to bring it even lower. Okay, let's talk about treatment of risk. And again, go back to my car. Treatment of risk generally means either the introduction of controls, the improvement of controls. Brakes are a control. And I'm saying here, brakes allow a car to go fast. I'm not saying to make them go fast. Brakes make a car go slow, but they allow you to go fast. I'm reminded of Charles Scharf of Visa. He said, a well-controlled environment gives you the license to do other things. So think of good or strong controls allows you to do more. Good brakes allow you to go fast, because how fast would you go with no brakes or bad brakes? So think of it that way. If you have a well-controlled environment, you can accept more risk. Okay. Risk treatment is generally categorized into two: control or financing. You either reduce the level of risk, minimizing the exposure, or you say, well, take the car. If I have a crash, I've got insurance. Insurance will pay for it, so I've transferred it. Is the risk financing? Sorry, but in risk control, it would be doing the service, checking the tires, checking the oil. Terminate, treat, tolerate, transfer. The 4 T's I like to use. And terminate, if you're demolishing have the job to demolish a building, and there's asbestos in the building, you would probably say, I'm going to stop doing this job. I'm going to terminate. I'm not going to take on this risk because I don't have the skills. And instead, you will transfer the risk maybe to somebody else. If you're a builder, maybe you have decided this isn't one of your areas of expertise and you don't take on any jobs with that, or if you have a job, that part of it you will transfer to somebody else. So you're avoiding it, but you're also transferring it to somebody else. Treat is probably the most usual, and I know it's under risk treatment, but some people call this at the top level risk response, and treatment, doing something to reduce the risk, is the most common reaction or response to risk. So let's have a look at that. Things you do to reduce the risk before you have an event or some loss event would be your policies, your procedures. These are all controls. Training and educating people. The design of, it could be the design of a farm, it could be the design of a building, it could be, you know, generally when people are designing things, it's to reduce risk and to make it highly effective. Communication, signage, housekeeping, depending on the risk, you'll see one or all of these will apply. If you're thinking of security, then alarms, cameras, you know, bars on the windows, these are all controls. This is just a selection, but I want you to see these as controls and not see control as a word I don't understand in risk. You do. It's stuff you're doing every day. After the event, and I think this is where risks are often poorly managed, especially risks that are 5 in consequence and a 1 in likelihood, because people think, oh, it won't happen for 50 years, but it could happen tomorrow. That could be a cybersecurity attack on your organization. If you haven't thought about it and haven't thought how you would respond and stop the infection within the first 5 minutes, if you haven't thought about that and put the measures in place, then you're probably out of business tomorrow if that hits you. So have a response plan, whatever it is, and train people in that response plan. It's no good having a plan that just 1 or 2 people know about. People will have a role to play. And don't forget the communications. Communications internally with employees, with staff members, with tenants, with regulators, with funders. Think about it in advance. I'll give you an example in technology because this is an area that I would be comfortable with. When considering systems, you know, new systems for technology, you would look at the resilience of the system. Redundancy, perhaps that's dual power supply, or you have maybe 2 systems. That you have backups of the data and you're doing it every hour, so that if you have something, a loss event, you can go to your backup fairly quickly. And by the way, I would say on this one, have the backups off your network, so that if your network is severely compromised, you still have a clean copy of your data. Good question to ask. Do we keep a copy of our data off the network? Okay. These you'd be familiar with: antivirus, firewall, access control. Are these policies and procedures, you know, that who has access to your systems, and when they leave the organization, is that access revoked? Stuff like that. These are controls that should be in place. Okay. Let's talk about risk appetite. If interested, let me know, but we do a half-an-hour session purely on risk appetite. I'm going to give it about 3 minutes today. No, I'll give it 5 minutes. It is poorly understood, but in definition, it's the amount and type of risk an organization is prepared to pursue, retain, or take. So how much are you going to risk in pursuit of that objective or those objectives? It's generally set by the board. Now, it might be the management team that will document it originally, but the board would certainly approve it. And it's information that everybody who's making a decision in the organization needs to know. They need to know how far they can go. They need to know how much they can spend, how much they can risk. That those boundaries need to be set. And it's also for the stakeholders who need to know that nobody's going to risk the whole organization on one poor decision. There needs to be some boundaries set. There are various definitions. You can read these in your own time, but if I take the Financial Stability Board's definition, probably closest to home, it's the aggregate level and types of risk a financial institution is willing to assume when they say financial institution, you can say any organization, within its risk capacity, that's an important one, and I'll cover that in a moment, to achieve its strategic objectives and business plan. So the aggregate level and types of risk. Okay, don't know if that helps, but let's have a look closer. In your risk appetite statement, and it's not one statement, it might be 2 pages, might be 3. You have to say what risks you will take. You know, will you take the risk of building student accommodation? You know, it is a risk, or maybe you won't. You state those things, what risks you will take, what risks you will not take. And maybe there's the unavoidable ones, things you have to do that the regulator says you have to do, you prefer not to, but you have to. And try and link them to your objectives, not just strategic objectives, but I would say even the operational ones. And it's setting limits. Down at its disaggregated level, you'll set limits as to the maximum spend on a project you might make without seeking partners in it. You'll set limits as to how much an individual can sign off when purchasing something. You know, we all have this in organizations, I'm sure, that, you know, you have multiple signatures. It might be 2, 3, or 4 in different levels of sign off. Those are kind of the detailed ones, but again, this will probably stem from the risk appetite. How would you do it? Well, I think I would start with each risk category or objective. And by risk category, you might say technology, or the risk objective might be on diversification. So start, if we take the objective, and then for each objective, I would say which is more important than which. You know, is profit more important than health and safety? I don't think so, but maybe you need to say that, because if you have 2 objectives, you need to clarify that, you know, these 3 we have no flexibility on, we will not compromise in any way, and the others we're flexible on. They're statements of appetite. You're stating it's a poor word, the word appetite. I would advise you only to use it in the title of the document, because that's what is expected, maybe a document that describes the appetite. But don't say, we don't have any appetite for IT outages, because it's meaningless. Nobody has an appetite for that. And this is why the word appetite is not liked by a lot of people. It's, but I'll come back to that. I'll give you some examples how you might write it. I think important statements are things that you will tolerate and not tolerate. It's important to state if you've no tolerance for willful breaching of compliance rules, obligations, legal obligations, then that must be stated and must be followed up with some disciplinary action. So state that. This is all part of your appetite. It's stating for internal and for the external stakeholders. They need to know your position on risk and what you're willing to do or not do. And if it's not stated, you're leaving it vague. So I would state all these. Okay. Here are some examples of statements from different sectors. Now I've pulled this from they're not all necessarily related to the housing associations, but we will only allow the finance department staff to use the company credit card. Very basic one, very simple one. Any expenditure over greater than 5,000 will require board approval. Now here's one on the bottom about that IT that I said I'd give you an example. Our core systems will have a minimum uptime of 99.5% during operating hours, 7 by 12 a day, 12 hours a day. And this is not saying that you've no appetite. It's not saying you want IT outages, but it's saying you can accept 25 minutes of downtime in any 1 week. Now you might say, well, no, even that's too much. Should be 5 minutes of downtime. Fine, then state it as that. But do be aware that if you move that 99.5 to 99.9, there's a cost. If you move it to 99.999, which Amazon would aim for, 5 nines is a lot more costly than 3 nines. So just be aware. So what is it? what is tolerable, I would say? What can you live with? Okay. Yeah, if you have zero tolerance for non-compliance, say it. Now I'm going to try and make this a bit more real for you. And I said about capacity. I don't like the word tolerance because as an engineer, it means one thing for me. But the FSB and other regulators like to use the word capacity. And I think that's better. It's what can the organization bear? What is its capacity to bear risk? It's the maximum amount of risk the organization is technically able to assume before breaching constraints determined by capital, liquidity, borrowing capacity, regulations, reputation, and operational environment. That's from the FSB. I think it's an excellent definition. But what is the operational environment and what determines it? I think that's your capability. And if you think about it, your appetite should be less than your capacity. If capacity is the edge of the table in my graphic here, my very basic graphic, you can't have an appetite greater than your capacity. So know your capacity, and this is the difficult one. Are you getting the right metrics? Do you know how good you are? Do you know what controls you've in place? Do you know if they're working? And the capability then is it's your experience. If you've been doing this for 25 years, you probably have more capability than somebody who's been doing it for 3 years, all depending on the individual experiences, of course, of individuals. But it's like anything. The more you do it, the better you get at it. So know your capacity and set your appetite appropriately. I hope that graphic, is to summarize risk appetite. That's it. That's it. Okay, folks. Risk criteria. This is the easier one. That 1 to 5. What does a 1 mean? What does a 5 mean? I would say the risk officer can define it initially, and again, it's approved by the senior management team and the board. It should be consistent with the appetite. So if you're saying a 4 is unacceptable, then the definition of appetite in 4 should be reflective of, should have language that you can relate to in the appetite statements. Some people only use appetite, but you need some kind of a yardstick for people to assess risks, and it's hard to put all of the appetite into that. Well, let me show you. It might look like this. This is a screenshot from our system. You might have 5 criteria like profit, service users, reputation, approvals, people, and you use those as your starting point to define, well, what does a 5 look like, in terms of profit? Well, it's a loss of 3 million and so on. Not enough time today to go into more detail, but basically it's for each of these axes defining what a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in likelihood is. And I think I had there 1 is every 3 months or more frequent. And if it's, somebody said to me once, well, what if it's happening every week? I would say, well, it's not a risk then, is it? It's habit. Where's the uncertainty? You know what's going to happen next week. So manage it like you manage anything that has that level of certainty. Okay. Reporting. In my work with ISO, I'm involved in a task group to look at surveys on risk management from across the world, and we've looked at 12 recently, and we're doing up a report as to what they're telling us about risk management globally. And one of the things that stands out for me in that is that there is a deficiency in, one, the quality of reporting to the board, and also the level of interrogation that the board do on those reports. So there's a disconnect, I would say, and work to be done to improve that. Now, if I was on the board of a housing association, sort of things I'd like to know is, well, what are the top 10 risks we're facing at a higher level? I don't need to know the detailed stuff, but at the higher level. What's threatening the objectives that we have set? We've set 7 objectives here for the organization. Are there any in danger of not being achieved? And what are the biggest risks to those objectives? tie it back to the objectives, folks. That's what the board want to know. That's what I'd want to know as a board member. I don't know the detail. I'm not in the organization every day. Think of me as a non-executive. I will want to know if the controls are working, if they're effective, because at the end of the day, the board have to attest as to the effectiveness of controls. So if I ask you, were there any attempted hacks into our network in the last month? And you say you don't know, that doesn't fill me with confidence. But if you say, yes, there were 5 attempts and we fended them all off successfully, but however, we did notice that our firewall came under great pressure and it's showing its age and we need to move to the next generation. Okay, now I'm reassured that this is somebody who understands and is monitoring and is already thinking about the next fix. I want to know if there's been any near misses or incidents. And I would say to you guys, don't hide these, the near misses, the risk events, the loss events, the errors and omissions. Different organizations call them different things. Capture these, because how many times have you experienced something big and bad happens and somebody says, we should have seen that coming. And often what tells you are the precursor, the near misses that happened, 3 or 4 times. And the next time it wasn't a near miss, it was a direct hit. So record them because they are valuable intelligence and telling you the control isn't working, you need to modify it. As a director, I'd like to know that you're capturing those. I don't need to know the detail. I need to know that they are being monitored, captured, and we are continuously improving. Again, we do a session on resilience, and I would say resilience, you're at the level of maturity, I would consider the highest level in resilience if you have that culture in the organization of continuous improvement. You're never happy with the level you have at the moment. You're always looking to improve. I think it's a good culture to have. Don't be unhappy, but always want to be better. Obviously, I want to know if we're compliant, where are the gaps, if we're non-compliant. And by the way, if anybody says to me that we're 100% compliant in something, I would be suspicious. I would expect there's always going to be a gap. I need to know if it's material and if I need to be worried about it. And if it is material, what's being done? I said I'd mention CalQRisk indicators, and let me talk to you about a few of them. Sorry, this is from our software, the top 10 risks and compliance. Have some graphics. Don't give the board 70 pages of information to read, because they won't read it. Depending on how many minutes, and it will be minutes that are dedicated to the discussion on risk management and compliance. It might be 10, it might be 15, it might be half an hour, depending on the time of year. Have three pages, 10 pages, 20 pages. But you're talking about 3 to 10 pages, I would say, typically in a report. Okay, CalQRisk indicators. You don't need 50 of these, but I would say pick one at least in each category here that you're measuring. Think of it as your early indicator. Don't wait till something big happens. Complaints are a good one, and they're in here under the stress indicators. Think of if complaints are rising, that trend, that 10, 15, 20 that you've seen the last 3 months. Excuse me. If you know, and if you're watching that, then you can react before it becomes a major problem. Exposure indicators, that's if you've got investments and the investment return is poor and decreasing, or the unemployment rate is rising, what implications does it have for your business? Outstanding debt and overdue. There are certain ratios and metrics that will be more relevant to you than others. So have a few of these. Have a few stress indicators, like if there are sick days. I mean, stress indicators I describe as significant rise in the use of resources, people and material. If you're getting busier and you're not adding the people and the existing people are getting stressed and going off sick because they're stressed, you know, there is an early warning indicator there in terms of sick days. You know, be aware of that and be cognizant that maybe you need to provide more resources. For example, causal indicators. Have you been able to recruit for those vacant positions in the last 6 months? Have you gaps in recruitment, and why? You know, what's causing that? Is it reputation of the company because you don't train people and you put them in stressful jobs? You know, there's a little bit more ephemeral. Failure indicators. These are the most obvious ones. Poor performance or failing controls. Again, complaints will fit in this. You know, if something didn't happen, service isn't good enough, repairs weren't done well. If you have a data breach, a small data breach, big data breach, even the small ones, capture them all. Policy breaches. Capture, you know, half a dozen key risk indicators that will tell you, finger on the pulse, things are good or things are heading in a negative direction. Okay, I want to kind of finish on roles and responsibilities, and I'm going to borrow the 3 lines model. It used to be called the 3 lines of defense model, but they dropped the word defense because defense sounds like it's protecting the value, and there's a recognition that it not only protects, but it creates value. And that is totally consistent with the 31,000 in risk management core principle, that risk management creates and protects value. So let me show you in a slide. And this is a busy one, but I'll try and work through it. The different roles and responsibilities of the different players in the organization. So we'll start with the board, or the governing body in this model. It's the board. Their responsibility is one of oversight. They need to know that risk is being managed well. Not managing the risk, but ensuring that it is being managed. I know sometimes it says the board have to manage the risk. No, they don't actually manage it, manage their own risk. But in the organization, it's managed by everybody else. And the board has to ensure that it is being managed. The board will define objectives for the organization and for the risk management, establish structures, provide the resources, set the appetite. And of course, they'll establish the internal audit, which is part of that feedback mechanism. Are things working? It's easy to note that this model comes from the Institute of Internal Auditors. Okay, so the doers. This is the coalface. This is everybody from the CEO down. These are the risk owners, and therefore the risk managers. Everybody manages the risk in their area. They can identify which controls are working better than anybody else and what are not working and where there are gaps. They're the ones to implement the processes that you have designed. So they will know what's working, what's not working. And they should be responsive to that and reactive and reporting on that and saying, this isn't working, we need to change it. The second line of defense, and by the way, the governing body isn't even down as one of the 3 lines. It's although they do mention somewhere that it is effectively a 4th line but they didn't want to change the name of the model from 3 lines. The second line of defense is the risk officer and compliance officer. If they're called risk manager in your organization, that's unfortunate because everybody else is the risk manager. These people don't manage the risk. The risk management officers, they ensure that everybody else can manage the risk. They have the expertise so they can train other people in how to manage it, what the process is for risk assessment, risk treatment. They can advise, they can challenge. You know, if they see somebody isn't managing the risk the way it should, they can challenge that, and they should. They have to report up to the board, and it should be to the board, that the risk is being managed well, because that's a vital piece of information the board will need to have that understanding where the risk is being managed well. Internal audit, fairly obvious, and they're the 3rd line of defense. There is a bit of overlap with the 2nd line, and they should work together. There should be that communication, and you can see it here. Because you don't want the same audit being done 2 weeks in a row. They can share the results, if you like, as the risk officer will be doing their own kind of audit. And then sometimes you have to go to an external body, like pen testers, who will come in. That's just an example. Somebody who has the expertise to give you an assessment on a particular area in your business where you mightn't have the expertise. So that's it in a nutshell. You can download that document from the Institute of Internal Auditors. It's about a 10-page document on the 3 lines model. Okay, and I think I've just managed to finish just within the hour, so happy to take questions and a little drink. Do we have any questions? Okay, on the top or the bottom of your screen, you will find chat or Q&A, and it's better in the Q&A. If you go into Q&A and you can write your question, I'll attempt to answer it.
Jerry, Rachel has raised her hand, so she may want to ask a question in person. If you go into
I'm just going to go participants now and find Rachel. Oh yeah, there we go. Rachel, I'm allowing you to talk.
Great.
Hi. Hello, Rachel.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Great. I was just saying my question is about second line reporting. We would like to, as an organisation, develop our second line of reporting, but we don't want the board to become too bogged down by granular detail.
Indeed.
But we also want, I don't want it to be just another report that gets, lost in the mist sort of thing. So have you come across any effective ways of second line reporting that is valued?
To the board, is it?
To the board or to executives, whatever, any way that you found where it's worked well would be useful to know.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put you back on mute. Thank you, Rachel, for that question. So it's on board reporting, and if I go back on the slide, it's from the second line here to the board of directors and that reporting. And as Rachel said, and this has been the experience as well, that often the second line overwhelm the board, I would say, with too much detail, and it'll be one, probably not fully understood, and at worst not even read. So there needs to be, I would say, efficient reporting. Now, we did a session last year on reporting to the board, Rachel, so we could share that one with you. I think there might be a link even still. I think it was about a half an hour. From my ISO work and the 12 reviews that we did around the world, there were some suggestions of what might be in it. It's probably too long to answer here now, but I would say happy to share the link with you if we still have it in the library. I would start with the objectives, I would say, in terms of reporting. And if I go back to my slide previously to that. To this slide. If you could do that in 3 pages, that would probably be my answer for today. But you'd have to know the organization and know the objectives, and I would say tailor it around that. And happy to engage in a more detailed conversation. But yeah, I think my starting point would be objectives, and this would be my answer again for today without knowing the organization. I think it's hard to give a generic answer for everybody, but try and keep it. Have the detail in your back pocket so that if you do get a question, you can drill down that maybe there's some metrics you can agree with the board, that you can suggest that you prepare for each board meeting. I also think you might have a shorter meeting. Let's say if your board meets every month, have 3 pages every month. If once a quarter they have a longer session devoted to risk management, then maybe have 10 pages. And if once a year they want to review the effectiveness of risk management and they're devoting a half an hour or even an hour to it, then you'd have the 25, 30 pages. So and this is the model that I created in that other session, that depending on the meeting, depending on the organization, have kind of 3 formats ready. Happy to share that with you. Okay, there are some other questions. Okay, we share that. Yes, I will. Thank you. Okay, and incidentally, guys, on our website we have a white paper that we recently published on resilience, risk management and resilience. And it breaks, because resilience is a current theme by the regulators. They want organizations to be more resilient, to be able to withstand pandemics and to be able to withstand whatever the next disaster is, which I think is probably in the cybersecurity space. And this paper, it's about 28 pages, but it covers risk management, cybersecurity, business continuity, incident management, and disaster recovery. And it covers resilience from those 5 perspectives. So you can find that on our website. Is there another question? Q&A. Yeah, board members sometimes get scared, worried of the risks in their reporting. On the other hand, they think operationally we are too cavalier or not concerned enough. The difference is that operations deal with this on a day-to-day basis and so understand things at the ground level. How can we bridge this gap? That's a very good one, Anonymous. Okay. First of all, if I take the perspective of me as a board member, if I'm a board member, I've been around the block a few times. I know that life isn't perfect and bad things can happen, and it's not always our fault. But my job as a director is on behalf of the stakeholders, I would say, not shareholders, but stakeholders, to ensure the company is well managed. So I need to know the good and the bad, and I need to have the information. Don't overwhelm me with too many, but like anything, if you've got 20 or something and you don't want to bother the board, well, don't tell them 20, tell them the top 3 or top 5 that you're really worried about. Think of it as a risk-based approach. If you have 100 risks in your risk register, you're not going to share 100 risks with the board. You're going to share the top 15. They don't need to know about risk number 23. That is probably well managed anyway. Now, once a year, you might share the 100, so they know that number 23 is well managed. But focus on the stuff that matters. If they think you're too cavalier, then I would say, where is the risk appetite statement? Because if you're cavalier, that sounds to me like you're taking risks that are beyond the appetite of the organization. And why isn't there a document that you've agreed with the board to say how much you can spend, or how many projects you can take on, or where you can take on these projects? That should be all spelled out and agreed, so that your cavalier never comes into it. You're acting within the boundaries that have been agreed. So I would if you don't have a risk appetite statement, then there's a deficiency on the board's responsibility. They need to define that, and then you try to operate within that appetite. And what happens is there will be some risks that go outside of the appetite. And maybe you've got to go back to the board and say, we're being too risk averse and we need to take more risk here. And we can take it because we can put these controls in place, and argue the point as to why you want to take more risk when the board has said, oh, thus far and no further. That's a healthy discussion, and nobody needs to feel intimidated or browbeaten. Challenged, yes. And I had a slide in here, I took it out, it was on challenging respectfully. I think the board needs to challenge, but needs to do it in a way that doesn't cause, a breakdown in communication. I think questions can be submitted in advance before board meetings so that senior managers can prepare the answers rather than being caught on the back foot at a meeting. Just reading the question again, the differences in the questions. Yeah, I think that's in the reporting, that if you are taking risks, and let's say you do have a risk appetite, if they are within the appetite, then the assurance you have to give the board is you let them know the controls that you have in place. And if you have incidents, be honest and report them, but be ready to report how you've changed your policies, your procedures, possibly, so that it won't happen again. Because unless you tell me that, and I'm a board member, I'm going to ask, well, what are you doing to make sure this doesn't happen again, if you can? Yeah, it's better reporting is the answer. And maybe what we might do is we might resurrect that mini webinars, about a half an hour, 40 minutes that we did last year on reporting to the board. It sounds to me like there's an interest in that, and we can do it maybe for housing associations in a month or two. So watch out for that. Okay. Now, any other questions? Okay. I think that's it. We've gone over the time, but again, if you have any, I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions in chat. Happy if you want to send questions in on email as well. I'm always looking for a challenge, and watch out for future webinars. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attendance. Bye-bye.